The most wonderful thing I think about IANDS is the way in which we look at, think about, and focus on people's stories. And that is what I love most about this stuff. And I've been studying this stuff since the late 1960s. I didn't call any of it near-death experiences then. Raymond Moody was just a little guy, you know, probably, well, no, maybe he's my age. But anyway, we didn't have the term near-death experience at that time when I was in graduate school. But I am, at heart, an ethnographer. So getting people's stories and finding out about the details of the experiences and the way they made people feel was always most important and interesting to me. What I've been asked to do here, and I'm happy to do it, is different. It's focused on data. I'm reporting to a study that I did among combat veterans about near-death experiences and related experiences. And it is important, I think, no matter how much we love the stories, to recognize what researchers in general in the last 20 years have come around to, that it's really useful to mix our methodologies. The stories gain a lot from having data that's part of their context. And the data goes from being almost meaningless to meaning a lot by having stories that illustrate it, especially if the stories have a strong and valid connection to the data. So, what I'm going to be giving to you is primarily data. And I'm going to be putting a lot of it up on the screen. I hope you can see it. If you have trouble seeing it, I hope you'll move forward a bit. And I'll be restating it, but it's, you know how it is with data. If you can see it and hear it, it sort of helps to get it in focus. The one big advantage that I get, and this will help probably with time, is that when I do presentations mostly based on narratives, particularly about near-death experiences, I cry a lot. I'll come up to a story and I'll think, nah, I think I can do this. And I get halfway through it and then I choke up and I have to get my hanky out. So the data doesn't make me do that. So I'll be able to go straight ahead. But I want you to be thinking about the way the data relates to the stories, because that's what makes it important. Also, I want to be very clear. You'll see as I put up the methodology of the study, this is not only about near-death experiences. I took 3 different classes of extraordinary spiritual experiences, near-death experiences being one of them, and looked at them simultaneously within a combat veteran sample. And I'll tell you why I did that as we go along. So anyway, the overall cultural context of what we're talking about in these meetings, the context of Ray Moody's book, the context of my study, is what was summed up by Max Weber, who was the founder of sociology, basically, at the turn of the previous century, in the early 1900s. He said in his lecture on science as a vocation in 1918, the growing process of rationalization, by which he meant increasingly the use of reason, means the disenchantment of the world. And he's using disenchantment in the sense of magic gone. And he said, unlike the savage, that should be in quotes, who believed in such things, we need no longer have recourse to magic in order to control the spirits or pray to them. And that, sort of a product of Enlightenment materialism, several centuries old at that point, and revolutions in Reformation theology, and the philosophy that goes with those, all were part of this disenchantment. And as we get toward the end of my presentation, it's very striking to see that even in theology and pastoral care, a loss of intimacy with direct spiritual experience goes with modernity. Weber was right about that in a sense. But what people didn't know when Weber was writing this, and many people still don't know it, is that while the cultural overlay, the narrative of here's what modernity means, is woefully inaccurate in terms of the experiences and the results of those experiences of most people. It has not changed. That is, everybody thinks that in the Middle Ages, tons of people had visionary experiences and communication with the spirits, with God, etc. But not so much today, except maybe a small set of extreme religious groups. Well, that's simply not the case. And that's what IANDS and the related research to that is really about. And the resistance that we find, the skepticism, the pushback, which I'm going to be arguing to you using my data, causes great harm, emotional harm, medical harm, and religious harm, because the ignorance it's almost as harmful as ignorance of major aspects of clinical and pastoral categories of thought that people do accept. So we'll be talking about that harm too. So it's really important that we not only, it's not just to make things easier for us when we want to study near-death experiences, it's to help our society, our culture. There are people who need this knowledge and who need to have their care providers stop doing things like diagnosing them as psychotic, to stop giving them antipsychotic drugs because the family is concerned about the patient talking to people who aren't there. That's harmful. It's bad for people. So anyway, the upshot of what Weber was saying is this: no spirits in modernity, just not there. Now, of course, in modernity, everybody recognizes there is something called spirituality. That's okay. And in recent times, even in my area, in medicine, the category of spirituality and health has become a big deal. But I will tell you this: spirituality and health does not deal with spirits, as in the sense that, for example, near-death experience does. Spirits is a very uncomfortable word for people in the modern world, even people who are interested in things we're interested in. I've had people say, oh, don't use the word spirit or spirits. The plural is the especially uncomfortable one. In that article that you're writing, and people will just say, that's nonsense, it's not true, it can't be. Well, I'm sorry. Spirits, well, first of all, guess where the word spirituality comes from? This is not a big mystery. It's about spirits. And the plural, the only place that we're comfortable with that is outside of a store labeled wine and spirits. But that's not the only polite use. We should be able to talk about spirits without being embarrassed, without saying, oh, they're just like the savages. There are no savages. Well, I know some skeptics who are savages. At any rate, spiritual experience, very important to understand that you hear about spiritual experience all the time today, including in spirituality and health, and it's what social scientists call ordinary spiritual experiences, meaning ordinary experiences interpreted spiritually. So, for example, seeing a sunset and feeling gratitude to God for the beauty of nature, that's an ordinary spiritual experience. That doesn't mean that it's not special, but it means that if somebody else had that experience, it might not be a spiritual experience. If Carl Sagan looked at a beautiful sunset, it would be an astronomical experience for him. Not now, because he's dead, and I'm sure he's having much more spiritual experiences than he used to. But at any rate, that's what we mean by ordinary spiritual experiences. Extraordinary spiritual experiences, which I put in my title, are experiences that appear to be, to the subject, and to anyone who hears the story, to appear to be about perceptions of a spiritual, non-material reality. And the most characteristic aspect of those experiences are spirits. There are other aspects also. And how do you know it's a spirit? Well, Sometimes spirits look different from people who are not spirits, but particularly, as we know with near-death experiences, if you know they're dead and they walk into the room and talk to you, good enough. You know that's a spirit. You know that is not material. You know that it is not that you were mistaken and they got resuscitated. So that's what we mean by extraordinary spiritual experiences. And those are the ones that remain in modernity to be particularly problematic. Now, the modern assumptions about these is that extraordinary spiritual experiences require prior belief in spirits. That is, believing is seeing, as opposed to seeing being believing. So the conventional modern view is that belief in such things as real near-death experiences, spirits, visits from deceased loved ones, that those things only happen to people who believe in such things. And that means that then they're probably ordinary experiences, like maybe a dream or maybe a hallucination that was interpreted as being spiritual. And the reason that it seems to them that believing is seeing is that they think that belief in spirits is not rational in the modern world. We don't have time to take apart the word rational, but the problem is that for many people, rational means based on a material view of the universe. Actually, rational means good use of reason, inference, attention to evidence, thoughtful analysis, the kind of things that in near-death experience research show us that these are real experiences. You can't just call them non-rational or not rational because they are not based in a materialist philosophy. So actually that attitude in the modern world is a serious mistake. So with those beliefs, the idea is that extraordinary spiritual experiences must be non-Western, because people in those other cultures believe stuff like this, ancient, because people used to believe stuff like this, and if not one of those two things, must be pathological. Modern people who are living around here holding beliefs like that and saying these things happen must be crazy, particularly because if they say they really saw what they saw, then they are describing a hallucination. But beyond those, skeptics generally assume that if extraordinary spiritual experiences are reported by contemporary subjects, Westerners, who are not obviously insane, they will be associated either with ignorance or extreme religiosity. Oh, these people simply live someplace where they had a very poor education. Or they belong to a small sect that insists that these things are true. My study that I'm going to summarize for you now contradicts that assumption. In fact, it contradicts most of the things that are part of the skeptical view. Now, the study, I did the data collection at about the same time that the Goza, Holden, and Kinsey? I'm sorry, I forget the third author's name, but the one published in Military Medicine on veteran near-death experiences. We collected our data at about the same time, that being finishing about 3 or 4 years ago. My study was funded by the Department of Defense, which I think was pretty cool. When they really see what I'm writing, I don't know. But I wasn't really expecting to get other Department of Defense grants anyway. So I have this slide up here. You don't have to read it or remember it. They just require me to put it up there if I'm going to present about it. So I had 2 sets of subjects, combat veterans and people who provide clinical care to veterans. The purpose of the study was to assess the prevalence of three particular extraordinary spiritual experience types among combat veterans. Near-death experiences, I won't even bother to give you a definition of that. I think you all know what I mean by near-death experiences. After-death contact, abbreviated ADCs very often, which I usually call bereavement visits because probably the largest number of these happen during the period when people have lost someone. Not just that period. You'll read in the psychiatric literature that now they realize these experiences can be normal, especially soon after the death. Well, actually, we know that they often go on and on. In fact, the physician who did the first study that gave us this information. His name is Dewey Rees. He's Welsh. He was practicing in the United Kingdom, and he wanted to go into hospice care. And he thought it would be helpful to him if he found out what were the things that made people who had just lost, who were bereaved, lost someone close to them. And so he did a survey of widows and widowers, all of those who were able to be interviewed, that is, who were competent to speak with someone in the county where he was practicing. It was a huge survey. And all he asked, he didn't give any specifics, he just said, what made things harder for you to deal with the grief, and what made it easier? He was shocked to find that the number one thing that made the grief easier was real visits from the deceased spouse. And that was more than half of his sample. And he also found, because he had clinical data, he found that people who had those experiences lost less sleep, did not have appetite disturbances, were less socially isolated, and dealt with their grief better. Exactly the opposite of what was at that point in the literature. He published his study in the British Medical Journal, a very, very reputable journal, and it did have an impact. But at the time he published that, and even for the next 4 or 5 years, I've found in my literature review, primary symptom of psychotic grieving is hallucination of the deceased, especially if the subject believes it was real and tried to communicate with the hallucination. Well, Rees showed us that those who are fortunate enough to have that experience are not psychotic. They are less aggrieved. They are able to sleep better. They're happier. And Rees also found out that these experiences go on for a long time. He went on to become a hospice physician, and he published a book for hospice physicians in the 80s, I think it was, so maybe close to 20 years after he did the initial study. And he had a chapter in there that helps us know what he had found out since the time he did the study. And he said these experiences often go on for years. And he knew people who, when it was suggested to them that they consider remarrying, said, no, my relationship with my dead husband is just fine, husband or wife, spouse. And some cases, which he outlined in the book, where the deceased spouse came and said, you know, I think you and that person have something going here that's nice. It's okay. I think you should get married. And did. Now, by the way, another psychiatric issue, Bruce, you can correct me afterwards if I'm mistaken about this, but I would say that seeking and accepting advice from the dead who are in your room talking to you is another psychiatric no-no. Many people would think that indicates poor judgment. It all depends on what the advice of the person had been like, whether it was good advice when they were alive. I don't know whether it gets better after they die. But at any rate, it's not the case that it's only normal when these are in the immediate vicinity of the death. They don't always go on, but they can go on for years or even decades. Then finally, the third class of experience that I put into the study, and the reason for these three classes of experience is that they all came into our awareness in the early to mid-1970s. Since that time, they all have a solid base of research. We have national and international data about their prevalence. We know details of the phenomenology of the experiences, and we have some basic information about their clinical relevance. And I think it's important to know what the relationship of these experiences with one another are. So the third one, sleep paralysis with a spiritual presence, is what's illustrated on the cover of my book here. By the way, this is still in print, makes an excellent gift. Cover suitable for framing, as you see. Now, sleep paralysis with a spiritual presence, waking up during the night unable to move. That's sleep paralysis. And it was known It had been known for decades when I started looking at this around 1970. And sometimes the descriptions would say, sometimes accompanied by terrifying hallucinations. Didn't say what those hallucinations were. Probably the people who were doing the work had never asked. But it was considered to be rare. It was considered actually to be one of 4 characteristic symptoms of narcolepsy, which itself is relatively rare. It's not rare. And it's not just paralysis. In most of the cases, and in my studies and others that have been done, one of which was national in scope, the content, the spiritual content, is there in 80% of the paralysis experiences. And that doesn't matter where you're doing. I don't have time to go into the details on this, but I started the study in Newfoundland, Canada, where my professors had told me I should go to look for the stuff I was interested in because I needed a kind of backward, isolated culture to find it. So I went to Newfoundland, seemed to fit the description. Actually, Newfoundland's a wonderful place. I loved it. I almost decided, wound up staying there to live. And I value and admire the culture there. But a part of the reason for that is I went and I asked about spiritual experiences that people talked about in Newfoundland, where people said that these were things that had happened to people, to Newfoundlanders. And the first thing people started talking to me about was what they called the old hag, which sounds like a female insult, but actually this was not meant to identify a gender. It was an old reference to the possibility that it was caused by witchcraft, which was why they called it hag. And they said, what happens is, you wake up, you hear the door to your room open, you hear footsteps approaching the bed, usually shuffling footsteps, and you find you can't move, and when it gets to the bed, it climbs up on the bed, and then it sits on your chest, and it's terrifying. The thing is evil. The thing that's most horrifying about the experience is this sense of evil. And they believed that if you couldn't get out of it, that it might kill you. Now, since I know in a room this size, some of you have had this experience, it cannot kill you. I mean, there's no reason to think that it would ever kill you, unless you have a cardiac condition that might make it so any terribly stressful, frightening event might cause death. But that would not generally be the case. So anyway, it's terrifying. And in Newfoundland, I thought, well, I wonder how many people this really happened to, because people said this is common. So I did a survey, and 18% of my samples in Newfoundland, various ages and different parts of the society, 18% said it had happened to them. I thought, that's amazing. That's a lot. As soon as I finished my dissertation fieldwork and came back to the US, took up my job at the medical school at Penn State, I started doing more surveys. My favorite one, well, the first survey I did was in the community surrounding the medical center. I asked, have you ever awakened unable to move? And if so, what happened? And I got 18% of those people said it had happened to them, and that they were shocked that I had asked. And I always ask people if they told anyone else about any of these experiences. They almost always say no. And I say, why haven't you ever told anybody about this fascinating experience? They all say the same thing. I didn't want people to think I was crazy. It's the psychiatric stigma. Anyway, after I did the community around, I decided I ought to really do a survey with my medical students. They're a pretty different group from the folks in Newfoundland, 18%. And they all also had not told anybody else. And they were terrified of it. And they said, this thing is evil. Now I have examples from every cultural area of the world. And the prevalence is about the same. The sense of evil, it's not that in some cultures they say it's nice, others they say it's evil. The sense of evil is consistent. I don't know why. But at any rate, it is a spiritual experience, a terrifying spiritual experience, less known, even definitely less known than near-death experiences or after-death communication, probably because the idea of evil spiritual experience is even more verboten in the modern world, and less attractive to people who find cool spiritual experiences neat and good and interesting to study. But I do know that as with the other two, well, that all three of these classes of extraordinary spiritual experience have been used to diagnose psychotic illness. That's a problem. None of them are symptoms of psychotic illness. One of the colleagues who cooperated with me on the combat vet study, who's head of the Psychiatric Institute at Medical University of South Carolina, did a survey of American psychiatrists, sending out a description of one person's real, and it was a veteran, one person's sleep paralysis experience, and asked for guesses about what might be a diagnosis for this. And nobody got it right. But 2/3 of the people said some kind of psychotic experience. Psychotic disorder. Only 1/3 just said some kind of sleep disorder, but they didn't know what kind. Most of these people have probably heard of sleep paralysis, but when you are honest and tell people what happened during sleep paralysis, they forget everything they knew about sleep paralysis and start thinking about what they consider to be hallucinations. So anyway, the purpose of this study, in addition to looking at the prevalence and relationship with those extraordinary spiritual experiences, was also to assess their association with cultural issues like religiosity and education, which are conventional explanations for such experiences, and to appraise the response of military care providers to such experiences. And I think you're going to be kind of impressed by what their response has been. Okay, so here's the veteran sample. I started out trying to do this in active duty personnel on bases. I was working with the Samueli Institute at that point, and it was through their granting procedure that I got the DoD funding. But when we went to people on bases and said we showed them what the study involved, these three kinds of experiences, they all said, we can't let you do that here, it's not safe. If any of our subjects, any of our active duty people said, yes, that's happened to me, they would have to be referred for psychiatric evaluation. It would be terrible for their career. We just shouldn't do it. So I had to go off base and had to work through the community with non-active duty veterans. So it's a convenient sample from two different places, one from the Philadelphia area where I am, and the other from Charleston, South Carolina, where my colleague at the Medical University of South Carolina is. And the average age was 41. They came from all branches of service. Now, looking first at all three of these extraordinary spiritual experience types, in this sample of vets, and I have to tell you, it's not random, but by convenient sample, I mean the staff of the Medical University's psychiatric unit went out with these questionnaires, and there's a 26-page questionnaire, and just found people who were vets and said, would you be willing to do this survey? It's about spiritual experiences. And anybody who said yes, they gave them that, no name on it, no number to connect it with the person you've given it to, so it's 100% anonymous, and given them an envelope to please send it back when you're finished. Almost everybody did return them. So let's see, where was I? So anyway, that's the nature of this sample. And we found in this, and I think it's close to random. Oh, and by the way, there was no difference between the subjects from the two different locales. So that's really support for the validity of the findings on association that we made. 31% of that sample hadn't had any of these experiences, just 31%. 26.6% had had one of them. 26.6% had had two of them, and 15.8% had had all three. In other words, 69% of the combat vet sample reported having had one or more of these three experiences, and only 31% said they hadn't had any. All of these prevalence rates were far higher than the general population. Now, looking at the educational level of the vet sample, as we should expect, given the nature of the military today, it's substantially better, they were substantially better educated than the general population. They all had high school diplomas, of course. 80% had some college. Almost half had a bachelor's degree or more, and there were several with graduate degrees. So this was a pretty significantly sophisticated and educated group. We used well-established instruments for assessing, it's called self-ranking, religiosity and spirituality of the people who were responding to us. There were no significant differences among veterans, care providers, or the general public in terms of their self-ranking of how spiritual and religious they were. On a 4-point scale, they all registered as slightly more spiritual than religious, but on both spirituality and religion, they were below the midpoint. So they were moderately, you would say, religious and spiritual. Definitely not anything extreme about their religiosity and spirituality. We also used a scale that looks at people's willingness to interpret an experience as spiritually significant. It's called the Daily Spiritual Experience Scale. It has 6 questions, the brief form that we used, with a maximum score of 36. The GSS number there, that's a national random sample. The American population in general scores in the 23 to 24 on the scale. The total vet sample registered substantially below that with 19.76. So they are significantly less likely to interpret any old experience as being spiritual. Now, the association of those 3 spiritual experiences with higher educational attainment, lower religiosity and spirituality, and less inclination to interpret experiences as spiritual all run contradictory to the conventional skeptical assumptions about ESEs. This was not, I remember when I first started to get these high numbers, some people said, well, part of your sample's from South Carolina, they're down south, those are very religious people down there. Well, not the people in my sample. And that does not account for their experiences. They're less religious, probably, than the average person in South Carolina, definitely less religious than the American population, but they had these. Near-death experiences, the subjects were all asked, first of all, Gallup's question, this is from his 1982 book, Adventures in Immortality. He asked, have you yourself ever been on the verge of death or had a close call which involved any unusual experience at that time? And you had to, if you said yes to that, then we administered Bruce Grayson's 16-question near-death experience survey. And that has a scoring norm that's been developed for it. And those who score 7 or more on that scale are counted as near-death experiencers. This is also what goes in Holden in their combat veteran study used. So what we're looking at in that case is only people who came close to dying. And actually, as you might expect in a veteran sample, the majority of them had come close to dying, but not all of them. So only those who did come close to dying were asked the question. So the prevalence, which is the rate of near-death experience reporting in the total vet sample, was 37.7%, scoring 7 or more. That's 17 vets out of the 45. And that we would call prevalence. And comparing that to the general population using European, Australian, and American surveys, it's been suggested by IANDS that somewhere between 4 and 15% of the whole population have had near-death experiences. A lot depends on the criteria being used. That's why the range is so broad. Our combat vet prevalence was more than twice the general population estimate. Now, looking at incidence, and this is the rate of near-death experiences in the cohort reporting a close call with death. And Bruce, I want to talk to you after this and make sure I'm using prevalence and incidence correctly. Bruce has written about that, and we almost always use them wrong. I think I got this right. So now, for incidence, we're looking at only those who said yes, they had come close to death, that cohort. And that was 46%. We can compare that to Pim van Lommel's classical study in The Lancet in 2001, looking at cardiac arrest survivors who had been clinically dead and later reported a near-death experience. He found 18%. Our vet incidence of near-death experiences among those coming close to death was more than twice as high. Also, I should say, well, let's say two things. I should have put more data on this slide, but you wouldn't have been able to read it. The Goza, Holden et al. Study, you see here the scores on the Grayson scale. Our score and their score, average score, is almost identical. Also, they were really looking at incidents because they had only asked people who had come close to dying to answer their survey. And they came up with 29%. We came up with much more, but excuse me, we can't really compare them because of the different methodologies in use here. Now, moving on from near-death experiences to after-death communication. In the combat vet sample, 58% said they had had that experience. Now, we compared this, on all of these, one reason for using these particular categories is that we wanted to be able to compare to large national samples. And here, Andrew Greeley, University of Chicago National Opinion Research Corporation, in 1974, published a national survey with a sample size of almost 1,500 people from all 50 states, asking the question, have you ever really been in communication with someone you knew was dead? And he shocked the world. He got on the front page of the New York Times when his monograph came out with his finding of 27%. And that's held up, as you see on the other two, in Europe and in later studies in the United States, somewhere in the mid to upper 20s is what you consistently get. We were getting more than twice that. Remarkably common. Moving on to sleep paralysis with a presence, we found 31% of the vets had had this. The Roper survey was published in, I think it was 1984. They had an almost 6,000 person national random sample. And they found what the rest of us keep finding, 18% of the American population said that had happened to them. Now we might ask, why are the rates of these experiences so high among the vets? I think that there are a couple of possibilities. One is the circumstances of combat. I was shocked when I went to do this work to find that nobody had ever looked at any of these things in a combat vet sample. Why not? Combat with surrounding you with death, trauma, pain, loss of sleep, emotional stress. Why wouldn't you wonder about spiritual experiences? Well, anyway, either people had not wondered or thought they already knew the answer. So it could be the circumstances of combat. And as I said, I can't really compare our prevalence data to Goza et al. Because of the different methodologies. Although part of the methodology that could account for it is that ours is totally anonymous. The other study was an online study, which is hard to guarantee anonymity on, but everybody who did our survey knew that no one would ever be able to come and ask them a question about their responses. I would have liked to, but I thought that what we needed to get the best, clean, honest answers was to tell people no one will ever know who said this. So the anonymous methodology may be part of it, but clearly the conventional explanation for extraordinary spiritual experiences do not fit any of our findings. This is an extraordinarily high prevalence on all three of these experiences that just 40 years ago everybody in the medical community assumed were psychotic symptoms. Very, very high prevalence rate. in this sample that is better educated than the rest of the American population, less religious than the rest of the American population, and less inclined to interpret experiences spiritually than the rest of the American population. That really should give us a lot of confidence in these high rates. Now, as I said, in addition to knowing about the vets and their experiences, I wanted to know about the provider's response. Now, I had 32 providers. All of them had extensive military clientele, patient populations. They were recruited from the Medical University of South Carolina community, and they were mostly clinical psychologists or nurses. There were some social workers also these were social workers who performed psychotherapy. Study's purpose was briefly explained to them as distinguishing, quote, significant psychological symptoms from intense spiritual experiences. So they knew, here's what you're supposed to be trying to do on this survey. And we gave them 6 vignettes. Oh wait, before I get to the vignettes, I'll give you the religious and spiritual self-ranking of the providers also, which turned out not to be different from the vet ranking or the national ranking. Everybody's a little more spiritual than religious, all of them less than sort of halfway, so moderately to slightly spiritual or religious. So the provider's questionnaire had 6 vignettes, 3 of them of well-known clinical psychiatric symptoms like post-traumatic stress disorder flashback, and the 3 extraordinary spiritual experiences under study. And these vignettes were 200 to 300 words long. And the spiritual experience vignettes were all taken from real people's experiences. They were all veteran experiences. And for each experience, we asked, how often have you heard such an account, and how would you respond? And the response possibilities ranged from reassure the patient to refer the patient to a psychiatrist. Well, we found an average familiarity, this is across all 3 of the psychiatric symptoms, that these folks were moderately familiar. They should have been more familiar, but of course nobody's going to recognize everybody's vignette of even a conventional experience. The average familiarity with all 3 of the ESEs was 1.78. This is on a 5-point scale. So that means they all ranged in responses between I have rarely ever heard such a thing to I have never heard of such a thing. How would you respond to such an account? Near-death experience and after-death communication, most people left blank. I guess they just couldn't stand it. Those who answered said they would treat and refer. All would refer to a psychiatrist except one who chose a psychologist. No referrals to a chaplain were chosen for an NDE, and 1 was chosen for after-death communication. I thought it wise to include chaplain as one possibility because it does sort of seem like maybe on some of these things you'd want to think about a chaplain. And not on your own. I didn't mean, oh, you have to think of this yourself. I'll remind you, did you think of a chaplain? No. Sleep paralysis with a presence, all who replied would treat and refer to a psychiatrist or psychologist, which is remarkable. I mean, of these 3, sleep paralysis is the only one that has a well-established, known clinical category, I would say, diagnostic category. But once you put the details of what the experience is like into the description, they can't recognize it. So providers did not recognize extraordinary spiritual experiences, and on average, they considered these vignettes to be symptomatic of severe psychiatric illness. They would treat, they would not reassure, and they would refer to a psychiatrist. Now, I'm almost at the end here. I want to say 4 things about this set of experience classes. First of all 3 of them have a history of being used to diagnose psychiatric illness, and long history. But they are not indicative, symptomatic of any illness. They all have a greatly underestimated prevalence in modern subjects, but have now been shown to be common and universally distributed in the US as well as in whatever other society you might think would be tending to have such things. In fact, not only also found here, but found here at the same rate and with the same contents. And the contents are important. They have complex cross-contextually, sorry to use such a funny term, but I mean across cultures, basically, but not only across cultures. So, for example, in the US, it's hard to find anybody who's never heard of a dead person coming to visit a living person. And they would probably use the term ghost rather than spirit. You can, although you can't find a naive population, which would be ideal, you can find people who have been taught, no, 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 you must never say such a thing happened. So, for example, Jehovah's Witnesses are taught that at the moment of death, people go into what's called a soul sleep, absent consciousness, just out until the last judgment. Jehovah's Witnesses get these visits too. It's a problem to them. They're not supposed to, but they do. I have not been able, it would be really hard to do this in a way that could give us a really good prevalence figure, but definitely they happen for those folks. So you can certainly find contexts as well as cultures that give you that kind of difference. So the experience features that have this complex nature in the literature, in the academic literature, have all been described in vague and general terms. You can imagine why, when people came across something like a near-death experience, they said, oh, and they had a vision of going to heaven. Why didn't anybody say, oh my gosh, we see that in several different people, I wonder why they all say the same thing? It's too vague. There's nothing surprising about that. You need to know, I mean, like with the sleep paralysis with the presence, it's not just the opening of the door, and it's not just the footsteps, it's that everybody says it sounds like they took their shoes off. It's a shuffling footstep approaching the bed. They say that in Thailand. My medical students said that. The Inuit say that in the high Arctic. Oh boy. These complex, the stability of these complex patterns is quite remarkable. And also, the fact that these are all taken to be real by almost everyone who has them. It's hard for them to admit it in some contexts, but I find very few people who don't think that they were real, people who've had them. And that brings us back again to psychiatric decision-making, because now, well, like with the visits from deceased loved ones, those are now called, they're no longer called characteristic symptoms of psychotic grieving, they're called the normal hallucinations of grief. So that's better, but it's really not what the people who have them call them. And you have to say, come on, lack of insight. Insight means knowing what's really going on, so that the patient who comes in and says, doc, my hallucinations are getting worse, I think I need more medication, that's good. The person who comes in and says, I'm not taking that medication anymore, these are not hallucinations, they're real, that's bad. Okay, that's the standard on insight. Here, in these experiences, if they are hallucinations, they are completely unlike psychotic hallucinations on the insight range. Normal, healthy people consider them to be real. And in fact, those who have them tend to be either normal or have superior psychological health. Well, that's really kind of hard to reconcile to misunderstood psychiatric illness. So our basic conclusions, these experiences are normal, at least 2 of them are psychologically helpful. The almost universal belief that these are real is rational, and when people get better knowledge of each, it strengthens their belief rather than weakening it. And near-death experiences clearly fit within the larger class of ESEs and benefit from being studied within that context. I can't give you all the reasons that I say that about the benefit, but one I will give you is that one of the explanations of NDEs that keeps coming up as if it was newly discovered is called REM breakthrough. REM being rapid eye movement sleep, which is characterized by loss of muscle tone in the body. So there is a paralysis that goes with REM. REM can break through into wakefulness. And it does seem that sleep paralysis is that kind of breakthrough. And by the way, I've written a lot about, yes, this is sleep paralysis, but I have to insist that does not explain it. That would be like saying, well, after you found out that near-death experience all over the world looks like what we now have read about, and then you say, oh, but a lot of them had cardiac arrest. Well, sure, they had cardiac arrest, so what would you expect? Well, you would not expect this. Associating that experience with that physiological event doesn't explain it. It does the reverse. And in fact, the same thing is true with REM breakthrough, just as a quick aside here. If people just had scary dreams about not being able to move during sleep paralysis, there would be nothing surprising about it. That's not what happens. Anyway, that's one advantage. So anyway, the finding here shows you that, and the fact that near-death experiences and sleep paralysis in our study have no statistical association. If, in fact, near-death experiences were characteristic of REM breakthrough, there would be a strong association. There isn't any association at all in our study, at any rate. That's very contradictory to that common explanation. So our findings contradict all the conventional skeptical assumptions about ESEs. The findings also show that clinical harm is being caused by the current ignorance, not only misdiagnosis, which is plenty of harm, but the stigma of psychiatric illness based on the experience that has been shown to be health promoting. You know, the fact that people who have the experiences that Reese found to be probably the most powerful thing that people have that helps them to get through grief lead to being diagnosed as psychotically ill, submitted to prolonged psychotherapy, maybe medication. And of course, with near-death experiences, people used to always get treated for delirium in hospitals when they would try to report near-death experiences. Hopefully that doesn't happen so much anymore. But this is causing harm to people. And I would like to emphasize, and this is my last point here, that it's not only harm to the experiencer, it's harm to those around them and to the society who are deprived of the opportunity to benefit from this knowledge. And I'll give you a very quick example of my own from my family. My mother had a near-death experience in the 1970s. And when my father was dying, they stayed at my house at the end of his life. He had Alzheimer's disease. He had some terminal lucidity toward the end, which was a beautiful thing. And the morning that he died, around 5 in the morning, my mom woke up and she heard him stop breathing. Well, what did she do? She remembered what it was like when she died. She had an idea of where he was. She figured he could see what was happening, and she had a conversation with him. She was greatly comforted by that. I gave that, the way I'm giving it here, although with more detail, at a conference that I was part of in Utah, and the father of the man who was hosting the conference was in a sort of toward the end of life in an assisted living facility. While I was there, his daughter took her son, my friend's grandson, to visit Pop in the assisted living place. They walked in and he had died, but the nurses hadn't noticed it. So they were the first people to find him dead. And she came to me and told me this afterwards. She said, when I saw he was dead, and my first thought was, what a terrible thing for my child. And then she thought, well, no. And then she turned to him and said, remember what your grandfather told us about that man talking about his mom's experience and how she talked to her husband after he died? We know from these experiences what it's like after they die. So he's probably here in the room. He can hear us. Why don't we sit down and have a talk with him? Which they did. There, I almost cried, even talking about data. Well, this isn't data anymore. But anyway, in that case, there was someone who had never had a near-death experience, No one in her family ever had a near-death experience. She heard someone talk about me talking about my mother's near-death experience, and she could use it. How many people, if they only knew about these things, would have both for their own mental health and for the support they could give to others, be in a better place? A better place than where the culture continues to say, irrational fantasy, potentially psychotic, can't be real, not rational, primitive. That's wrong, and it's doing harm. And it's really sad that medicine and pastoral care are the two places where the greatest resistance is found, in my experience. And those are the two places where people who feel the need to find out about unusual things that have happened to them should feel free to go. We're fortunate that most people think, should I? No, probably not. I've had ministers tell me about their experience and say, I wish I could talk to my congregation about it, but I know I'd get fired if I did. So anyway, more harm. This does harm under the name of being modern, sophisticated, and sort of clinically adept. Really important, I think. So anyway, I'm over.